This one I call The Budding Scientists and the Centrifuge. Back in the late 50s, we entered high school at just the right time. Although the space race was a couple of years away, the Cold War was at its height, and both sides were placing tremendous emphasis on science and engineering. Now, there at Breckenridge Training School, they started a special elective science course called Experimental Science. The idea was that the students would run experiments and build science projects to exhibit at the regional science fair. A handful of us were talked into taking the course by our science teacher, Miss Nilo, who assured us that it would be a lot of fun in addition to learning some science. My good buddy John was especially pleased to hear about the fun part. You see, although smart as a whip, he was at this juncture of his life long on the fun and a bit short on the learning. The first few days were spent in boring demonstrations and lectures on proper lab procedures and the scientific method. John began right away to figure ways that he could entertain himself. Miss Nilo kept some lab rats in wire cages in a back room off the main lab. John had never heard of B.F. Skinner or operant conditioning, but he knew how to train rats. His lessons consisted of sneaking into the back room and jabbing pencils through the wire at those rats, making them mean and irritable. Within a few days, Miss Nilo started showing up with Band-Aids on several of her fingers and exclaiming that she couldn't understand why her lab rats, which were normally so docile and affectionate, had taken to biting and scratching every time she reached her hand in the cage. John also had a way with fish. The lab had a big 50-gallon aquarium filled with various and sundry plants, fish, and crustaceans. It was a source of pride for Miss Nilo, who was quick to point out the balanced ecosystem and how the various life forms coexisted to their mutual benefit. Well, not for long they didn't. After trying unsuccessfully to secure some piranha, John pursued other avenues. He was adept with his fingers, and so the lock on the chemical cabinet posed no obstacle to him whatsoever. He found the bottle of mercury and proceeded to administer a few drops to the fish tank. Well, as you might imagine, it wasn't long before all the fish were belly up, with the other life forms not looking so hot either. When she found her aquarium in such a sad state, our undaunted teacher proceeded to empty the entire tank, wash down the glass, install new gravel in the bottom, refill the aquarium, and purchase new fish, seaweed, and other bottom crawlies. Things were fine for a couple of days until John once again reapplied the mercury. Reasoning that there must have been some residual contamination, our intrepid science mentor again drained, refilled, and restocked. Well, when the entire contents of the aquarium had expired within another 3 or 4 days, see, John was now experimenting with other chemicals, Miss Nilo became suspicious, and so John decided that he would move on to other scientific challenges. The science department had recently purchased an ultraviolet light demonstration kit consisting of a UV light and some crayon-type markers. Writing with the markers under normal light produced an invisible image which could only be seen when the room lights were turned off and the ultraviolet light activated. It was with great delight that our science teacher demonstrated this amazing phenomenon. John caught on pretty quickly. He knew that our school was hosting a science conference in which about a dozen other schools would be visiting that weekend, and that Miss Nilo was planning to demonstrate the UV light kit. So unbeknown to our science instructor, John sort of borrowed the marking crayon and proceeded to write words and phrases which would make a sailor cringe all over the walls, desks, and blackboard of the science lab. We both managed to find excuses for being absent from the conference that weekend. We knew we could never keep a straight face, but the later descriptions of the adult gasps, the student guffaws, and the embarrassed apologies when the UV light was turned on were absolutely priceless. Now, another of John's scientific adventures involved the school's model of a volcano. Just about every school had one. It stood maybe a foot high and was hollow to hold a small metal cap just inside the lip of the crater. Miss Nilo carefully poured some powdered chemicals into the cap. The names of the actual chemicals escape me after all these years. What I do remember, though, is that the prescribed amount was 1 measured capful of the white stuff and 1/2 capful of the yellow stuff. She then touched this mixture off with a lighted match, and we proceeded to view a volcanic eruption in miniature. It fizzed and smoked and threw a bit of ash down the sides of the crater. Everyone seemed pretty impressed with the demonstration, except John. So when the bell rang ending class and the students started filing out to their next class, John waited until Miss Nilo walked back to her desk. Seizing the moment, he removed the small metal cap and emptied a jar of the white stuff and a half jar of the yellow stuff into the model. Showing his superior intelligence, he handed me the match. Not truly realizing the gravity of the moment, I willingly set it off. The flash was somewhat equivalent to that of a small tactical nuke going off at close range. The whooshing sound was accompanied by the rattling of every bottle of chemicals in the chemical cabinet, one of the window blinds spontaneously rolling completely up and flapping several times, and the picture of Albert Einstein, which hung on the wall, falling off and landing in the aquarium. Luckily, there were no actual casualties, that is, unless you count the volcano model itself, the top of which was peeled back like a banana, and resembled pictures I've seen of artillery cannons when a shell explodes in the barrel. Unlike our previous escapes, this time we were standing right there, me with the offending match still in my hand, eyebrows singed, half blinded by the flash, and darn near as startled as everybody else. The smoke was pretty thick for a few minutes, and the ash given off from those chemicals settled a half-inch deep on everything. While perhaps not quite rivaling Mount St. Helens in ferocity, our short-lived little model did give a pretty good account of itself. John and I landed in the principal's office. We didn't get paddled, but we did have to clean up the mess we created, and we had to clean up the lab every day for the rest of the school year. The worst part was getting the big smoke smudge off the ceiling. We got a ladder and scrubbed it several times with little effect. For all I know, those smudges may still be there. Well, our next foray into science was rocketry. As my project for the experimental science class, I built a rocket. Made of aluminum tubing, it stood about 3 feet high with balsa wood fins and nose cone. While I painted on some flames and other neat markings, John volunteered to secure the rocket fuel. He found a formula in some rocketry book. We later found out the mixture was quite powerful and used only by serious rocketeers. So potent were these chemicals that the local drugstore would not even sell them to him. So John got busy and secured them through a couple of college students in what amounted to a chemical black market. A few years later, these guys would probably have been selling LSD, PCP, and coke instead. You know, it does conjure up, though, an image of a rocket fueled with hallucinogens weaving and looping lazily across the sky. Well, nevertheless, armed with rocket and fuel, we entered the field behind John's house. We wouldn't have known an electrical ignition system if it had jumped up and bitten us. So once we got it fueled, we just stuck about 6 inches of dynamite fuse into the tail. John got me to light it. I just never seemed to learn. And we both ran like hell. Now, the fact that I tripped and fell flat on my face was perhaps all that saved me. For at that moment, that rocket did not spew forth flame and climb majestically into the sky. Rather, it exploded with the equivalent force of about 2 sticks of dynamite, blowing out the window in John's dad's garage and rattling dishes in houses for about a 3-block radius. John, who was started running before I did, was knocked from his feet, winding up with 2 small shrapnel wounds in his leg. Our celebration didn't last long. Okay, the rocket didn't fly, but you should have heard that explosion. Well, then the police arrived, and when it was all sorted out, we both got whippings. You know, you would think that budding scientific inquiry would have been given a little more latitude. Well, my final science project that year was a centrifuge. There was a lot of military experimentation going on at this time with rocket sleds and centrifuges to test the effects of acceleration on humans. My thoughts for the science fair ran more to experimenting with lab rats, as if John hadn't done enough to them already. So I secured an old washing machine motor and mounted it face up on a big piece of plywood. Dad helped me wire it so when I turned it on, it would be in the spin cycle. John helped bolt a piece of metal conduit across the rotor so that about 3 feet stuck out on either side. We then constructed a small wire cage and lined it with foam rubber. Hey, we weren't sadists, you know. And we bolted it to one end of the conduit. All was ready. John brought out the rat. He borrowed the pair of gloves Miss Nilo had recently purchased to handle her now belligerent rats. He placed Charlie. Miss Nilo would never have considered harming her lab animals, so she gave them all names. Well, anyway, John placed Charlie in the cage under her watchful and uneasy eye. It had taken a whale of a lot of persuading to get her to agree to let us use one of her rats. I threw the switch, and we were all startled how quickly the centrifuge got up to speed and how fast that speed was. The little cage was just a blur as a whoomp, 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 whoomp signaled each revolution. "Stop, stop, stop," yelled Miss Nilo as the first drops of rat urine splashed across her face. See, with each revolution, that rat's bladder was emptying at a record rate, and walls, desks, and all of us were getting doused. So regrettably, I pulled the plug, and the centrifuge slowed to a stop. Now, the first thing we noticed about Charlie when John pulled him from the cage was that his eyes were crossed. John set him on the desktop. He took a step or two and then drunkenly fell over on his side, where he stayed for several minutes. Miss Nilo seemed terribly distressed at what we'd done to him, but after a few minutes he was able to climb onto his feet and hobble about. Actually, old Charlie recovered fully. If you dismiss the fact that from then on he would urinate every time John got close to him. Our centrifuge experiments were curtailed immediately, but with the science fair coming up shortly, there was no time to get another project together. So John and I decided that we simply would not enter the fair that year. But Miss Nilo would have none of it, and told us we would have to enter our centrifuge even though we had only attempted the one abortive experiment. So we packed up our washing machine motor, conduit, and wire cage and hopped on the bus to Louisville in the big regional science fair. We unpacked and set up our centrifuge, but neither one of us had any records or experimental data or analysis or conclusions. In other words, we were going to have to wing it. Now the judging started, and after several minutes, a very portly man approached our booth. He introduced himself as a scientist at the nearby university. We both decided right then and there that if he was a scientist, he didn't pay much attention to what the scientific journals had to say about nutrition and exercise. Discretion being the better part of valor, I decided to do what I always did when John and I found ourselves in a tight spot. I would let John do the talking. "And what have we here?" asked the judge. "A centrifuge," volunteered John succinctly. "And what does it do?" queried the rotund man with the clipboard and pencil. "Goes around in a circle, real fast." See, John could really cut to the chase when he wanted. "And what did you put in there?" asked the man, noticing the empty cage. "A rat." "And what happened then?" "Made him dizzier than hell." See, John's elocution was not quite as advanced as his scientific prowess. Well, the judge looked us both over with a jaundiced eye, wondering what he'd gotten himself into with these two eastern Kentucky heathens. "Well, did you notice any other effects?" asked our inquisitor. "Yup." "And what was that?" "Made him piss a lot," answered John. "As a matter of fact, he pissed on the walls, he pissed on the desk, he even pissed on Miss Nilo. Got her right across the face. Man, you should have..." You see, John could pick the most inopportune times to wax eloquent about details. Well, the man harumphed a couple of times to quiet John. We could tell by now that he was anxious to be on his way. "And did you draw any conclusions from this?" "Yeah, you get a rat dizzy enough, he'll piss all over the place." "Yes, well, good luck to you young men," he said as our science judge quickly beat a hasty retreat. Now, science fairs then were set up so that each exhibitor was supposed to be visited by at least 3 judges. Shortly thereafter, we saw our judge speaking to some of the other judges. We couldn't make out what he said, but he made sure he pointed us out to them. Imagine our surprise when we didn't have another single judge stop by all afternoon. See, everybody gets something from a science fair. There are blue ribbons for the top winners, and then there are red and white ribbons for those not quite so good. John and I didn't get any ribbons. Matter of fact, every exhibitor, whether they win any ribbons or not, is supposed to get a certificate to verify that they at least showed up. John and I talked on the way home about how we were a bit disappointed that we didn't even get a certificate. We figured, well, they must have just forgotten to give us ours.